This move, nf3, is a flexible and common opening choice that develops a knight towards the center while preparing for kingside castling and avoiding early commitment to a specific pawn structure. This symmetrical response maintains flexibility, preparing for various Indian defenses or other common hypermodern setups that aim to control the center from a distance. This move establishes central control with the d-pawn, aiming to create a solid pawn triangle and prepare for further development in various popular openings like the Queen's Indian or Nimzo Indian. This move develops a piece and prepares to support the center, embracing a flexible pawn structure that can transition into various established defenses like the Nimzo Indian or Queen's Indian. This move 3, c4 stakes a claim in the center and prepares to support the d4 pawn while potentially challenging black's control of key central squares, characteristic of many queen's pawn openings aiming for positional advantage. This move prepares to fianchetto the queen's bishop to b7, aiming to control the long diagonal and put pressure on white's central pawns. This move prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop to g2, supporting the center and controlling the long diagonal, a common theme in various hypermodern openings. Developing the bishop to the fianchetto square controls the long diagonal and supports the central pawn push. Developing the bishop to g2 prepares to castle kingside and allows the bishop to exert pressure along the long diagonal towards black's queenside. This move, developing the bishop to e7, is a standard and solid response in many queen's pawn openings, preparing to castle kingside and connect the rooks, while also reinforcing the central pawn structure. Castling kingside secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard developing move in this Queen's Indian or Nimzo Indian setup. Black completes development and secures the king, transposing into a variation of the Queen's Indian defense, preparing to contest the center with d5. This move develops a knight to a natural square, reinforcing the center and preparing for potential central pawn advances or further piece coordination. This move strategically challenges white's central control and prepares to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside attack or a central pawn break later in the game. This move prepares to challenge black's well-placed knight on e4 and supports a potential advance of the d-pawn, aiming to gain central space and initiative. This move exchanges black's knight for white's knight on c3, opening the c-file for white's queen and potentially weakening white's pawn structure if the queen moves away and the knight on f3 recaptures. Capturing with the queen on c3 opens the c-file for potential future queen activity and develops a piece to an active central square, controlling important dark squares. This move actively challenges white's central pawn control, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and potentially create an isolated queen's pawn for white. This move prepares to develop the queenside bishop to a more active diagonal, creating a potential battery with the queen and challenging black's central control by supporting a d4-d5 pawn advance. Developing the bishop to f6 creates an active attacking threat along the a1-h8 diagonal and prepares to potentially challenge white's central pawn structure. Developing the bishop to b2 activates it on the long diagonal, aiming towards black's queenside and supporting a potential kingside attack. This move, cx-d4, liberates black's position by exchanging the c-pawn for white's d-pawn, opening the c-file and creating an isolated d-pawn for white which can become a target. This move recaptures the pawn, centralizing the knight and preparing to challenge black's bishop on f6, while simultaneously opening the d-file for potential future pressure. This exchange of bishops simplifies white's structure and removes a strong attacking piece from black's defense. This move recaptures the bishop, centralizes the king, and prepares to connect the rooks, though it does expose the king slightly. Black strikes at the center with d5, challenging white's pawn control and opening lines for their pieces, particularly the queen and bishop. This move strategically places the rook on an open file, preparing to exert pressure along the d-file and potentially supporting pawn advances or rook sacrifices later in the game. This move resolves pawn tension in the center and opens the d-file, allowing black to challenge white's central control and potentially activate the queen. This recapture on c4 re-establishes material equality and opens the d-file for white's rook, aiming to pressure black's central pawn on d5. This move is a strategic decision to challenge white's central control and potentially exploit the weak dark squares on the queenside by activating the queen along the c8-h3 diagonal. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position, leading to a pawn structure where white's central pawn majority on the queenside will be a key positional advantage in the ensuing endgame. Black reclaims the central file with the rook, preparing to challenge white's control of the d-file and create counterplay. This move strategically opens lines for white's pieces, particularly the queen's rook, and prepares to challenge black's central pawn structure. The knight's maneuver to a6 aims to redeploy to c5 or b4, challenging white's central control and potentially activating the queenside. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create attacking chances and open lines against black's potentially vulnerable king. The knight repositions to b4, challenging white's control of the center and preparing to infiltrate on the c2 or a2 squares, while also potentially creating a battery with the queen along the a3-f8 diagonal. The pawn advance to e5 cramps black's knight on d6, forcing it to move and potentially weakening the d-file control. The move b7 repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the crucial d6 square and prepare for potential pawn advances in the center while also keeping an eye on the kingside. This move activates the bishop to a more active diagonal, targeting the enemy pawn on c5 and preparing to contest the now open c-file. The bishop retreats to f8 to protect the d6 pawn and prepare for potential pawn advances in the center or kingside. By exchanging the bishop for the knight, white aims to simplify the position and exploit the weakened dark squares on black's queenside, potentially leading to pawn structure weaknesses. Black recaptures the bishop, simplifying the position and opening the a-file for potential counterplay. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create weaknesses in black's pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces towards the black king. This move prepares to contest the open c-file and develop the rook to a more active square, potentially initiating a queenside pawn push or supporting a future central advance. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to break open lines against black's king and create attacking chances. This move opens the e-file for black's rook and challenges white's central pawn majority, aiming to create counterplay and simplify the position. This move initiates a pawn break that aims to open lines for white's pieces and create attacking opportunities on the kingside, while simultaneously threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure. This move resolves the immediate tension in the center and prepares to contest the open c-file, aiming to activate the rook and disrupt white's pawn structure. The rook on d7 activates onto the 7th rank, a strategically vital position that aims to control open files and restrict black's pieces, particularly the king. The bishop retreats to f8 to defend the g7 pawn and prepare to potentially recapture on e5 if white's knight moves. This move repositions the rook to the only open file, aiming to put pressure on black's queenside and contest control of the crucial central file. This move weakens the dark squares around black's king, potentially creating targets for white's pieces after further pawn advances. Ing3 repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the crucial g-file and potentially support a kingside attack or defend the weakened kingside pawns. The bishop repositions to c5, eyeing the weak b2 pawn and supporting the d5 outpost, preparing for active piece play in the upcoming middle game. This move aims to reinforce the e5 pawn and create attacking chances on the queenside by opening a file for the rook. This rook retreat aims to support the pawn on g6 and prepare to redeploy to a more active square, likely c7, after potential further exchanges. This exchange simplifies the material and enters an endgame where white aims to exploit the open b file with his rook. Black recaptures the bishop, simplifying the position while aiming to contest the open c file and eliminate white's advanced passed pawn on e5. This pawn advance aims to restrict black's bishop and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. This move initiates a pawn break on the queenside, aiming to create an active passed pawn and open lines for the rook and bishop. This pawn capture opens the b-file for your rook, aiming to exploit white's slightly exposed king and potentially create mating threats or capture more material. This pawn trade simplifies the position, leaving black with a crucial passed pawn on the a-file that will require white's full attention. To stop, the rook now moves to the second rank to support the pawn's advance, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially trap black's rook. This move aims to reinforce the king's position and potentially create counterplay by preparing to activate the kingside pawns, while also preventing the white knight from easily penetrating further. This move prepares to support the rook's advance and potentially create a defensive structure for the king. The king now actively joins the defense of the weakened kingside pawn structure and prepares to support potential pawn advances. The rook now supports the pawn advance on the kingside and prepares to contest the open e-file, aiming to create pressure on black's weakened kingside structure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weak kingside pawn structure and preparing to support potential pawn advances or coordinate with other pieces. This knight maneuver prepares to reposition to the kingside, supporting a potential kingside attack or reinforcing the pawn chain while freeing the f-file for potential rook activity. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the open diagonal, preparing to contest control of the central squares and potentially support a kingside pawn advance. This knight redeployment to g3 aims to improve its central influence and prepare for potential kingside advances, while also defending against any immediate threats. This move activates the rook on the queenside, preparing to contest the open a-file and potentially create threats against white's king once the rooks are exchanged. The knight repositions to a more active central square, preparing to support potential pawn advances or join an attack on the kingside. The bishop repositions to the defensive e5 square, reinforcing the central pawn and preparing to support a potential knight advance or simply to offer an exchange if white's knight becomes too aggressive. This knight repositioning aims to control the critical central squares and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside, while also preparing for potential pawn advances or defensive maneuvers. This tactical check forces the white king to a less protected square, offering black an opportunity to exploit the weakened kingside and centralize their pieces further. This move is a crucial defensive maneuver to safeguard the king from the immediate attacking potential of black's rook and knight, preparing for potential tactical exchanges and centralizing the king for future endgame play. This move centralizes the black king, preparing to participate actively in the endgame and potentially support pawn advances, while also avoiding the immediate threats on the kingside. White repositions the rook to the second rank to potentially contest the open c-file and offer better support for the knight's advance. This move initiates a pawn advance on the queenside, aiming to create counterplay and potentially support the weak dark squares of black's king position. The rook on d1 now supports the pawn advance on b5 and eyes the open c-file, aiming to exploit the compromised pawn structure around black's king. This move, g5, aims to create space for the king and prevent further pawn advances by white on the kingside, though it weakens the dark squares around black's king. This rook move aims to reposition to a more active file, potentially threatening the weak pawn on a6 and controlling the open d-file while keeping options open for further coordination with the knight. This move initiates a pawn push to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's position and open lines for black's rook. This rook maneuver aims to redeploy the piece to a more active square, likely targeting the queenside pawns or reinforcing the kingside defense, while also preparing to contest the open files. This rook exchange simplifies the position and forces white's king out of its safe haven, potentially creating attacking opportunities for black on the queenside. The knight's centralizing maneuver aims to gain more influence over the board and prepare for potential pawn advances or threats against black's king. The bishop re-establishes a defensive presence on the d6 square, aiming to control the important central squares and potentially support a future advance of the remaining pawns on the queenside. The king repositions to g2, seeking greater safety behind the pawn shield and potentially preparing for future king activity in the endgame should the position simplify further. The black king actively enters the center, aiming to support the queenside pawn advance and contest the important central squares. The king steps forward to centralize, aiming to participate actively in the endgame and support the pawn majority on the kingside. The king's central advance to d4 is a dynamic decision, aiming to activate the monarch in the endgame and potentially create attacking opportunities or support pawn pushes. The king repositions to the center to activate and contest the important central squares as the pawn structure dictates an endgame dynamic. This move aggressively centralizes the black king, seeking active play in the endgame and preparing to support the a-pawn's advance. This knight check is a tactical maneuver to disrupt black's king's position and potentially win material or force an unfavorable exchange. This move is a critical decision in the endgame. The black king's centralizing effort aims to contest the d4 square and disrupt white's pawn majority, but it also exposes itself to potential checks and tactical threats from white's knight. This move king to d3 is essential for centralizing the king and preparing to support the passed pawn on the queenside while also defending against potential checks from black's remaining minor pieces. The king's active centralization continues, seeking to exploit potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure and create mating threats against the exposed white king. N4 repositions the knight to a central square, threatening the weak pawn on g5 and preparing to support the king or attack on the kingside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, potentially preparing to contest the d6 square or offer a trade to simplify into a more favorable Endgame for black. The knight delivers a decisive check, forcing the black king into a vulnerable position and clearing the way for white to advance their king and control central squares. The king's active pursuit into the opponent's territory is bold, but it risks isolation and exposure to potential discovered attacks or tactical threats from the remaining pieces. The king's recent activity has been instrumental in gaining space and controlling key squares. And this move continues to centralize the monarch, aiming to support the pawn majority and restrict black's knight activity. The move 52, kx3 is a logical recapture, simplifying the pawn structure and directly confronting the white king, aiming to create tactical complications or exploit potential weaknesses. The king's active centralizing march towards the queenside pawns is a critical endgame strategy to support the passed pawns and create mating threats. The king, having reached an advanced outpost, is now actively participating in the endgame, aiming to support the remaining pawns and potentially create counterplay. This knight check forces the black king to a more vulnerable square on the kingside, facilitating a strong follow-up attack with the white king. This move 54, kilogram 3 advances the king to a more active square, preparing to support the remaining pawns in the endgame and potentially create counterplay against white's exposed king. The knight repositions to d2, offering a flexible retreat and preparing to defend the kingside while potentially eyeing the central squares or a knight outpost on e4 if white can support it. This move strategically repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to pressure white's central pawns and potentially support a kingside pawn push. This move aims to contest the center and improve the knight's position by heading towards the strategically important d6 square, potentially targeting black's weak pawn structure or preparing for a central pawn push. The move 56, kf3 is a determined attempt to activate the king in the endgame, seeking to centralize it and potentially support a passed pawn, but it risks exposure to the knight's pressure on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting weaknesses in black's pawn structure and preparing to support a kingside advance. The move 57, k3 is a crucial attempt to centralize the king, aiming to create active play and potentially support the b-pawn, but it overlooks the immediate tactical threat posed by white's knight on b6 and bishop on c4 black's poorly defended pawn structure. This move forces the black king back, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially create an attack with the knight and rook. With the black king forced to retreat, the white knight on d5 controls crucial central squares and prepares to capture the d6 bishop, simplifying into a winning endgame. The knight now repositions to a more active square, aiming to control critical central squares and potentially support a kingside advance or attack the opponent's d-pawn. The pawn move h6 is a prophylactic measure, aiming to prevent the black knight from accessing the g4 square and also to create a potential escape square for the king on h7, which is useful given the opponent's active rook and bishop. The king advances to e6 to secure central space and prepare to support the queenside pawn majority. By advancing the a-pawn, the bishop repositions to d4, aiming to exploit the potential weakness of white's d-pawn and to maintain active piece play in the endgame. The knight repositions to d5, reinforcing the control of the central squares and preparing to advance the king to support the pawns, aiming to create a passed pawn on the kingside or create further complications. The pawn on c4 is now vulnerable to capture by the king, and the white king will be forced to move away from its current central outpost. This move repositions the knight to the powerful e7 square, controlling key central squares and preparing to support a pawn push or even attack the black bishop on d4. Black's bishop, having retreated to e5, aims to support the potential pawn push on g5 while also potentially repositioning to attack the white king's defenses if the opportunity arises. nd5 repositions the knight to a more active central square, ready to attack the bishop or support a pawn push, while also eyeing potential outposts and controlling key squares in the endgame. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, supporting a potential advance of the a-pawn and creating a defensive barrier for the king. The king's active centralization is a key strategic goal in this endgame, driving towards the weak kingside pawns and supporting a potential passed pawn advance. This move aims to reinforce the pawn chain by bringing the king closer to the b-pawn, preparing to advance it and create a passed pawn, while simultaneously maintaining the safety of the bishop. The knight on e3 is repositioned to defend the d5 pawn, preparing for a potential advance of the d-pawn to further restrict black's king and create passed pawns. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to support the central pawns and potentially create threats on the queenside. The knight's repositioning to f5 aims to control the critical e7 and d6 squares, potentially supporting an advance of the king or preparing for future pawn breaks in the center or on the kingside. This check aims to dislodge white's king from its potentially vulnerable current square and offers a chance to simplify into a more favorable endgame. Although the immediate threat is minimal, the king is advancing decisively into the center, preparing to support the pawns and potentially create a decisive passed pawn or exploit weaknesses. The move 67, Ka4 aims to bring the king closer to the center and support the potential advance of the a-pawn after white's king repositions. This knight maneuver aims to reposition to a more active square, potentially attacking the bishop on c3 or supporting a kingside pawn push, while also preparing to contest the central squares more effectively. This move repositions the bishop to the c3 square, a strong central outpost that supports a potential kingside attack and keeps an eye on white's d4 pawn, while simultaneously defending against white's pawn pushes. The knight's timely repositioning to c4 prepares for further advances into black's territory, potentially targeting weaknesses or supporting a central pawn push, while also defending against black's counterplay. This pawn push creates a passed pawn for black on the queenside, but it also weakens the kingside and may allow white's king to become more active. This pawn capture opens the g-file for the white rook, creating immediate attacking chances on the weakened black king position. The pawn push to h5 is a crucial attempt to create counterplay by opening lines for the g-pawn to advance, aiming to challenge white's king and potentially create a passed pawn on the h-file. This knight move improves its position by centralizing, supporting the potential advance of the f-pawn, and preparing to control key squares on the kingside if the opportunity arises. The pawn advance to h4 is a bold attempt to create counterplay and potential mating threats on the kingside, forcing white to consider the active presence of this pawn. This move creates a passed pawn on the f-file, which, supported by the king, becomes a significant threat that black must address, potentially diverting their pieces from defense. The pawn push intends to create a passed pawn on the h-file, a common endgame strategy aiming to either force promotion or distract the opponent's pieces. The move 73, f7 is a critical step in promoting the pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn that will require significant resources for black to stop. thereby gaining a material advantage. The pawn on h2 is now a passed pawn, and white's king is too far away to stop it from promoting, representing a critical tactical and strategic turning point in the endgame. The promotion of the pawn to a queen is a necessary consequence of the advantageous passed pawn, fundamentally altering the material balance and initiating the decisive endgame phase. The promotion of the h-pawn to a queen is the logical conclusion of a well-executed pawn race, forcing a checkmate sequence or significant material gain for black. The promotion of the pawn to a queen is imminent, and this move aims to prepare for the final push by securing the king's escape square and potentially creating tactical opportunities with the newly promoted queen. This is a forced exchange designed to create a passed pawn on the queenside, but it does not prevent the promotion of white's pawn. The promotion of the queen is imminent, and this capture is a forced sequence to prevent immediate mate, though it leads to a queen endgame where black's king is more active. This check forces the white king to move, allowing black to maintain initiative and potentially reposition their queen for further attacking possibilities. This king's move is a strategic maneuver to support the passed f-pawn by placing the king in a more active central position, aiming to prevent black's bishop from interfering and to prepare for the pawn's advancement towards promotion. This check forces white's king to an exposed square, allowing black to win the rook on d1 and regain material advantage. The move 78, kc5 is a proactive king move, centralizing and preparing to support the newly promoted queen while simultaneously threatening to capture black's bishop on c3. This is a perpetual check, offering a draw by repetition, which is the best outcome for black given white's promotion threat and superior pawn structure. This move sacrifices the king's advanced pawn to create a protected passed pawn on the queenside, aiming to exploit the king's exposed position. The current position is an endgame with queens and pawns, and black's queen move aims to maintain pressure on white's king, seeking counterplay along the open files. The queen's promotion is forced and leads to a complex endgame where white's king is dangerously exposed on an open diagonal, requiring precise defensive maneuvers to avoid immediate threats. This move forces the white king to a more vulnerable square, preventing the immediate recapture of the f7 pawn and potentially creating mating threats if white's king cannot be adequately protected. This move repositions the king to a safer square, preparing to defend the passed pawn and potentially create counterplay. This pawn push aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, potentially supported by the king, to create counterplay and distract white's queen from attacking black's king. This is a crucial moment. The white queen's check forces black's king to a specific square, setting up a discovered attack on the rook after the king moves. The move is a desperate attempt to avoid the immediate mating net and keep the king somewhat safer. But it doesn't change the fundamental material deficit or black's precarious position. This move forces the black king into a precarious check, aiming to gain a tempo and potentially disrupt black's coordinated pieces, which is crucial in this endgame scenario where the king is active but vulnerable. This move aims to defend the pawn on c3 and prepare for the eventual promotion of white's passed pawn on h3, while white seeks to exploit the exposed black king. This check forces the black king to the edge of the board, limiting its escape squares and setting up potential mating patterns or further material gains. This move is a critical defensive maneuver, allowing the king to escape the deadly discovered attack and potential mating net initiated by white's queen. This is a forcing check that aims to consolidate the winning advantage by forcing the black king into a position where it can be trapped and the promotion of the white pawn can be facilitated. With the opponent's king vulnerable on c1, black aims to exploit the exposed position and create mating threats, utilizing the newly promoted queen's power. The king's check forces the black queen to a vital square, continuing the mating net and simplifying into a winning endgame for white. The move aims to avoid the discovered attack on the king and consolidate the queen's position, preparing for further endgame play. The white queen delivers a crucial check, forcing the black king to move and maintaining the initiative, while preventing any immediate counterplay. The king's advanced position on c3 is a serious risk, and this move attempts to use the discovered check threat to force a beneficial simplification. Though it appears the white king is too well defended, the white king advances to b7, centralizing and preparing to support the passed b-pawn, aiming to create a decisive passed pawn on the queenside. The pawn push on b2 creates a passed pawn, aiming to become a queen and pose a significant endgame threat that white must carefully neutralize. With the king, this move forces the black king into a compromising position, leading to a decisive material advantage by forking the king and the queen. The move kb4 defends the pawn on b2 and prepares to advance the king further to support the passed b-pawn, which is the last hope for counterplay. The king is forced to move, and white's queen maintains the pressure while preventing the black king from finding safety. The queen is forced to move, and qc5 presents the best square to maintain control over important central and queenside squares, while keeping the king relatively safe. This forcing check aims to transition into a favorable king and pawn endgame by potentially forcing the black king further away from the critical squares, simplifying the position and creating a clearer path for white's king to support a passed pawn. The king is now positioned to escort the passed b-pawn, aiming for a decisive promotion and a race against white's king. This decisive check forces the black king into a mating net, highlighting the power of coordinated queen and knight activity in the endgame.